Good morning.
Morning.
So we are going to start our day learning about S93, advanced wood boilers. And given that we're talking about sales tax exemptions, we're also going to talk about another sales tax exemption. I think all of our favorites, the sales tax exemption of rewritten software. And then celebration. What?
Nothing.
Okay, and then a celebration of the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, and then this afternoon, we're gonna have a joint hearing on CTE financing. So that's our day. And with that, Abby, can you come on up and tell us about advanced wood boilers?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. For the record, Abby Shepherd, Office of Legislative Counsel. Would you like me to share my screen for S93? I have a couple of
Sure, that would be great. Thanks.
phases to talk about with the bill. Thank you, Sorsha, for the Zoom link. Great. Okay, so on its face, S93 looks like a very succinct little bill. It's one page. It adds a couple of lines into an existing effective date, which would extend an existing sales tax exemption. So, and then it's made effective on June 30th because it's currently set to expire on July 1st. So it extends it by 2 years. So that is what the bill does. And then the background, so that you know what has been done in the past, where this comes from, and what exactly is being exempt.
That is so helpful. Thank you.
Yes, because it sounds very easy on sort of first blush. But what is an advanced wood boiler? There is a statutory definition, and it's a boiler or furnace, so not just a boiler, that's installed as a primary central heating system. It has to be rated as high efficiency. And it talks about a gross calorific value, and I apologize, I'm not the best person to explain that. It has to be a high efficiency furnace or boiler. It has to contain at least 1 week of fuel storage, and then it has to meet other efficiency standards set by the Department of Environmental Conservation. So that means you're looking at very large, typically wood pellet boilers or furnaces. So that's sort of the product that is being exempt are these advanced wood boilers or furnaces. The history on this is a little more complex because it was enacted both in statute and there were provisions in session law. So it was initially enacted in 2018. It had a sunset from the start, so it has always been a temporary exemption. In the first 2 fiscal years, so in 2018 and 2019, there was a transfer from the Clean Energy Development Fund to make both the general fund, because at that time the sales tax was being split between the general fund and the ed fund. The Clean Energy Development Fund was transferring the amount of sales tax foregone because of this exemption. And that continued for 2 years. And then those provisions, as well as a reporting requirement, were sunset. The initial repeal was for July 1st, 2021. It has already been extended once to this July 1st, 2023. So this bill would then extend it another 2 years.
Yeah. So is the Clean Energy Development Fund gone away?
Not to my knowledge, no, that is still an existing fund, but that is not, it no longer is making the education fund whole for this exemption. And it was capped, the amount that was transferred was capped at $200,000 over 2 fiscal years. And I would defer to JFO to tell you how much this exemption actually cost. It was less than that.
Do we do this sales tax exemption on any other alternative heating systems or just wood?
There
Somebody buys a
are,
mini split, do they have to pay sales tax on that?
so there are other, sorry, I did not bring that. There are a couple of other sales tax exemptions that relate to sort of clean energy and renewable energy. Do you mind if I just stop sharing and pull up some information on that? To bring that up, my apologies. Or maybe it would make sense for me to regroup and come back with a quick, it's not necessarily a quick summary.
Okay.
But this is very specific to advanced wood boilers. In terms of mini splits, I don't know. But
Yeah, I mean, we have lots of other ways of doing non-carbon heating.
Yeah, I haven't ever heard sales tax exemption on mini split.
Do people pay sales tax on solar panels? Do you want some time to figure that out?
Here, let me just pull
Or do you say that? So we can give you time to figure that out.
see.
Scott's question is a good one. I mean, there's more and more energy saving devices out there, and I don't know if, I mean, advanced wood boiler already is out there, so we can consider that, but maybe at some point we should take a tour and see what we think is the best of the best, you know?
Do you mean a physical tour?
Hmm?
Do you mean like actually go out on a tour? Do you mean?
Well, it could be a tour.
Okay.
You know,
Okay.
there are people who could come in who could tell us all about their pet thing. We'd have to sort that out, or maybe we don't want to get into it. But there's a case to be made for things beyond advanced wood boilers getting an energy saving tax exemption. So,
Before we get into a debate on the merits of the bill, let's hear about the fiscal impact of it.
And I can answer part of that question, just pulling up some research I've done, and I would be happy to share. There is a fact sheet on this from the Department of Taxes that summarizes the statute. It seems simple, but is actually quite complex. So you have a couple of different exemptions that interact with renewable energy systems. So you have renewable energy generating facilities. There is an exemption for sales of tangible personal property, such as solar panels that are incorporated into those renewable energy systems. Also for home and business energy generation systems. So in terms of buying solar panels, those would also, if they're being bought to be incorporated into those systems, be exempt. But I can forward that to the committee.
Thanks.
And the reason we're doing this in short term and we're not making it permanent, is there a rationale to that?
I know that did come up as a question in Senate Finance, which is where the bill was first taken up and then voted out. It did not go to any other committees, to my knowledge. There was discussion about that, but it was kept at just another 2-year extension. So that's certainly a policy decision that could be made.
If I might, I was thinking the same thing, Carolyn, and I'm wondering if it makes sense to do short-term, understanding how quickly these technologies evolve.
Right.
Right, there might be something more advantageous in the future or whatever, you know what I mean?
Okay, yeah.
I've also heard the justification for the sunset is to have to keep revisiting it.
Okay.
Representative Damrow.
Are there any kind of other tax credits available for these types of systems, or, you know, is there stuff through Efficiency Vermont or?
Federally, absolutely. The inflation IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, definitely has a huge package of home and business-based renewable energy investments. There are different credits for that.
It's not like this is sort of a stranded type of generated, heating that has no credits attached to it or no other savings, no other ways of.
Correct. I'm not sure how it would interact with the federal credits, but the way this is set up is separate. It's not in any way linked to them, but it is possible that an individual could have a credit for both, but I'm not that familiar with the way the federal credits are structured. I could follow up on that. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question because sometimes we, is there a point to doing state spending if the federal spending is totally outsized to it, or is there a synthesis there? Representative Anthony and then Representative Sims.
I come at exemptions with a healthy skepticism, given the difficulty of curtailing them once they get legs. And we're about to revisit one of those. And so I'm wondering whether the flavor of the month or the year, one year it's wood boilers, and then rather than doing that and sunsetting and revisiting, why don't we think about how to incorporate our hopes and dreams for the climate into incentives to purchase, as in credits, rather than exemptions from the sales tax. It just raises a whole host of other issues, ideological and practical.
Yeah, and I certainly can appreciate the logic of sort of wanting to understand the whole universe and how this fits in rather than sort of one-off. I guess I'm curious, how often is it sort of standard to always attach a sunset, or is this more unique to have a sunset where in the context of?
I wouldn't say that it's unique, but not all exemptions are automatically enacted with a sunset. It's certainly, there's precedent for that reason of having it be revisited and reexamined frequently.
Yeah.
I'd also wonder, vis-a-vis Peter's question, but from a different angle, if we consider a lot of energy saving devices or whatnot, what's the metric that we're gonna use to say this one qualifies and that one doesn't? That ought to be the proof of the pudding, it seems to me. But rather than play with the buck or lobbyist group at the bottom, but sorry, my cynical approach.
No, I mean, is insulation exempt from sales tax? I honestly have no idea.
And are they all sort of separate, or are there any sales tax that sort of like, we have energy efficiency sales tax credits or exemptions, and then we like list a variety of things that might fall under that header, or are they all sort of, there's one for this thing and one for this thing?
So I am just scrolling through this fact sheet, which I find really useful because of the way it summarizes statute, but they're not neatly, these are all the exemptions. It just gives some different examples, such as solar energy, water heating, sort of breaks it out, some of the statutory language into actual examples. I'd be happy to forward that to everyone. I can just do that right now if that's useful.
Yeah, that'd be great. Scott, you're not raising your hand, right?
No.
Okay,
Just trying to get rid of extra sanitizer that I put on.
okay, sorry. Sorry to draw attention to that, I just really couldn't figure out who's going. Okay, I think with that, we'd love to hear about the fiscal impact of this.
Good morning, Patrick Titterton, Joint Fiscal Office. I would offer to post this up on the screen, but it's really short. So I can probably just tell you if that's fine. So for extending this exemption out 2 years, and I have to give Ted credit for doing this estimate, it's only about like up to $60,000 a year. There's only about 40 systems installed in the state every year, and they range from about $15,000 to $25,000 per system. So just sort of aggregating up from there, we can sort of impute what you should be collecting if it were not exempted. So.
Do you have any idea what income level households are that are purchasing these?
So it's my understanding that these are, the application for systems like these are more, for like buildings and commercial buildings. So you might not necessarily want to splurge on something like this for, I don't know, your 1,500 square foot home. Probably be a little too big for it. So yeah, it's mostly like larger buildings that these are applicable for.
Thank you.
And one reason that makes estimating this kind of handy is that, there are some incentives through there are rebates for these types of systems. So PUC does have data on, actual data for how many are typically installed in a given year. And they are, quite sizable rebates that are available for them. So there's a lot of incentive for people to actually go and get those. And that's why PUC does have the data that it has to share with us.
Did you say they shared it with us?
With the joint fiscal office, yeah,
Yeah, okay.
with Ted.
Thanks for fully clarifying that.
Is there only 15 or 20, no, 40 or so of these systems installed that we're talking about because of the definition of advanced wood boilers? I mean, if the definition was such that it would include something that would heat a smaller home or a smaller system, would that change anything? Does the definition of advanced wood boiler mean that it's only that is going to be used for commercial? You see what I mean?
I don't think it's a requirement that it would need to be used for commercial. When we get into questions about definitions, I like to defer to the lawyer if she has an answer. So I don't have an exact answer to that question.
Fair enough, thanks.
Oh, shall we defer to the lawyer
Yeah.
and see if she has an answer?
I can't see her
I
head.
answer that correctly. There's no commercial requirement, but it does require it to be a very large boiler or furnace, just by, as you said, the definition, has to be very high efficiency. It has to be 1 week of storage incorporated into the unit, which I think is the biggest large criteria to make it large. So you have to have 1 week of storage.
But
Oh, gosh.
couldn't you have 1 week of storage feeding a small boiler?
That's the way it was explained to me by folks who use these.
Yeah, that's it.
It's more of a technical.
Finish fiscal questions, go back to Abby. Any other, yes, cost questions?
I mean, I just would point out that if this is really just commercial application, I mean, they can expense this, that's a big tax deduction. They can depreciate them, that's a big tax deduction.
If it's a government purchase, they're not likely paying sales tax, right?
Well, it's government purchasing, but just a commercial.
Didn't we also, and this might also be a question for, when we changed the manufacturing input sales tax exemptions was that last year? Anyone?
Something like that.
So last year, okay. I remember that part of the inputs that were considered part of the manufacturing process included the production of energy or heat for that system.
But that would be the feedstock rather than the energy.
Feedstock?
Excuse me?
I'm gonna actually ask the
Okay.
attorney who worked on it, because you were
I'm not an attorney.
information whatsoever. I know. Okay, so that's another question for Abby when she comes up. Yes.
Would it be possible to estimate the fiscal impact if we change the definition to something that might be more broadly available and accessible to the individual?
So it's possible to estimate just about anything. The one little departure we'd be making, the one little departure that we'd be making there is, there is an existing sort of rebate program, like I mentioned at PUC, which makes accessing data for this much easier. You'd be, depending on what the new definition would be, we'd be sort of getting into territory where I'd have to be a little bit more creative.
And I guess it's hard for me not to think about this in the context of broader conversations around transitioning people away from fossil fuel use. And I think, one could argue that this is an opportunity to complement some of the other things that we're trying to do if we're asking people to shift to new ways of heating their homes, making sure that we're doing all the things we can to make sure that folks can afford to access the technology and the significant upfront costs that often associate shifting to heating our homes in different ways.
I just want to point out that part of the result of the statistics are that some of these are installed, and this is anecdotal, installed in otherwise tax exempt, that is to say, people who don't pay sales tax in that context. So they're large, it's an office building, it's a courthouse, it's a school, et cetera, but they wouldn't pay sales tax anyway. And so the sales tax fiscal impact is in a way misleading.
Well, when you were developing your estimate, did you take into account the fact that a lot of the folks buying these might already be exempt?
So the phrasing I used when I said the 60,000 was it could be up to $60,000. I think in reality, the estimate that Ted put together was a range of about 36 to 60,000. So sort of accounting for some of those considerations.
Thanks. Abby, do you want to come back?
Yes, just trying to follow up quickly on some of those questions. So you're correct, it was last session. It was discussed the session prior but did not pass. So I thought it might have been 2 years ago. I'm just looking into where the manufacturing exemption discusses energy production. So I'm just scrolling through, that was in Act 179 of last year. It talks about cooling, heating, providing, controlling the environment, transporting, storing waste to control pollution.
So heating.
It does include heating, yes. Controlling air quality, humidity, or temperature.
So I think this has become a more philosophical conversation than an actual fiscal conversation since we're only talking about $60,000, right? But I do think it's these sort of one-off. I don't know if I want to go as far as flavor of the month, as Representative Maslin said, but I hear that it's these one-off exemptions. Rather than either systemic exemptions or just an assumption that sales tax exists and people should pay it because it's part of the system. I think makes more sense sometimes than these one-off ones, but it's a very nice vehicle that the Senate sent us, and I appreciate that part of it at this point in the session. Other thoughts on this? Yeah.
Just wanted to remind the committee that when we grant a tax exemption, we're trying to incent a certain taxpayer behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And if we want to encourage people to use these boilers, it seems to me like the market we should be playing to is the household market. So if that's what we're trying to do, maybe there's some other reason that we've missed here that we haven't stumbled on yet, the intent of this. But we could easily make that change, and I think that 60,000 would grow, which isn't to our advantage, it's a decrease, but still it's for a good thing.
Yeah.
I think building on what Carolyn said, but also shifting it a little bit, we've been talking about businesses taking advantage of these large boilers, but I'm thinking about say, for example, the apartment building where maybe there's people who are living that are of moderate income and that are given the opportunity to have a greener heat source that potentially doesn't raise their rent as much as it would otherwise. So that's just another consideration.
Representative Anthony, Representative.
I really think the decision as to whether or not wood is a transitional or a technology to be embraced for all time, this should be left to the folks who deal with this as a policy matter. I'm very skeptical. My now no longer member friend from Williston, McCullough, said, we got to stop burning things to make energy, and it doesn't matter really in one sense what you burn. Sorry, but there we are.
We may have to agree to disagree on that one.
Okay, Demro, Beck, Odie, Maslin, and I think we're clearly getting to the realm of energy policy, which is not ours. And
I know that's.
We're going to need to bail on this conversation soon and send this bill somewhere else if we keep on going. So.
Just out of curiosity, more than anything else, is there a minimum BTU rating on these systems?
It's rated as high efficiency, meaning a higher heating value or gross calorific value of 85% or more. So I don't really, again, that's also energy policy, but my understanding is yes. It also says meeting other efficiency standards established by DEC. So my understanding is, yes, that does get into BTUs, but I'm not. very
Higher
versed to-
higher BTUs.
Yes.
Not like 60,000 or 100,000, but higher.
Sorry, I can't do that.
Just trying
I
to,
can
I'm just trying to wrap my head around what these things are.
I just also wanted to point out in the definition, the 1 week storage it requires the actual boiler or furnace to contain at least 1 week of storage. So I think that is where you eliminate the residential boilers or furnaces that have storage like next to it or like appurtenant to it, not being contained in the system.
Thanks.
I said all those people's names and I totally lost track of what that's what right now.
I just,
Self-organized team.
between tax credits and expensing and depreciation and lower operating costs, they don't need this. Probably
But there might be.
Representative Democrats.
We are back to what Representative Peck said, which is depreciation and expensing, and so there's something that I'm missing, and it is not going for homeowners or moderate income people. I just don't see this.
I think it was Representative Maslin next.
Yeah, just to round out the subject from a different quarter. Principal source of heat in my house is Russian fireplace, so-called finished heat, which instead of several hundred pounds of iron, is several tons of masonry and fireplace. So I'm heating, give you a tour next summer, if anybody wants to come see.
I've always wanted one of those. I'm very
I'm
jealous.
heating several tons of masonry on about 3 hours of fire a day. And it's pretty damn efficient, if you don't mind my saying so.
What's it called?
Heat sink.
Sometimes they're called Finnish heaters or Russian fireplace, depends on your,
And were you exempt from sales tax when you?
just,
I'm serious.
hardly.
Got the rocks for free.
The rocks, well, labor, you know.
Okay.
Already done.
So,
Representative Canfield,
tax policy question.
thank you.
No.
No.
Abby, is there an exemption for highly efficient wood boilers for residential?
Unless there's a residence that can have this size of a wood boiler, it's not specific to residential or commercial.
Just
So-
remember, we've dealt with it before, but it never happened, I guess.
There is the fuel exemption for residential use, but that's for the fuel side, not for the actual apparatus that's using. But yes, again, this is not specifically limited to commercial or residential, it's just by virtue of the size requirements that it does seem to generally not be used for residential purposes.
Last word.
Following up on Representative Canfield's question and another tax policy question, so are wood pellets exempt?
Yes,
Yeah.
that was
Or fuel.
explicitly added into the language 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, into the fuel exemption for residential use as a fuel, yes.
So not the machine, but the,
Right,
The pellets, yes, yep.
the
And
bag
it's
buy
specific to wood
or
pellets,
store.
exactly.
Or order and have come into, that are put into a big hopper outside your house to feed it.
And there was a presumption that they are used for, let me look at the language, sorry. It was a couple years ago, so I don't have it super fresh in my memory. Because wood pellets can be used for non-fuel purposes, but there is generally an exemption or a presumption that they're being used for residential purposes. Wood pellets sold to an individual on the vendor's premises or delivered to an individual's residence shall be presumed to be purchased for residential use, because it's only residential use that's exempt and shall be exempt unless the vendor knew or ought reasonably to have known that the wood pellets were not purchased for residential use.
Is there an exemption for cordwood as well? It's the same.
It is specific to wood pellets. It does say this is within the residential, or it's sales of electricity, oil, gas, and other fuels used in a residence for all domestic use, including heating. And then it has some other qualifications. So cordwood is not explicitly called out, but it
think it would-
may,
yeah.
likely falls into other fuels.
I don't pay sales tax.
it should be covered in the other fuels.
Breaking the law here. Okay. Thank you. Let's transition to another exemption that didn't have a sunset attached to it when it was passed, unfortunately. It might have made this process a little easier if it had. And talk about the pre-written software.
Yes, I have, and Sorcia's kindly posted a lot of documents under my name today. There is the primer that we discussed, I think, 2 months ago on sales tax on pre-written computer software, which I wasn't planning to go through again, although I do just want to highlight, I checked some of the states because there has been some movement around taxing software as a service in other states. So the lists of states are updated. But other than that, I wasn't planning on walking through that. There is also under my name, just checking how it's noted. Sorry. Just so we can all be on the same document. The S93, and it's a Ways and Means Amendment, that's how it's drafted currently. It is just a draft, it's draft 1.1. So I would be happy to share that with the committee if you'd like me to.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay. Okay, so it has draft all over it. It's just draft 1.1. So this would amend, sorry, scroll too quickly. It would amend S93. It would not change the existing exemption. It strikes out the effective dates and adds in several new sections. It retains the effective date for the extension of the sales tax exemption for advanced wood boilers, but it adds in other provisions that would repeal the 2015 session law exemption for pre-written computer software accessed remotely, the cloud, just to use fewer words, taxing cloud software. This is a slightly It's along the lines of the same intent of what has been passed out of the House most recently, which was not to tax only software as a service, but to tax all of the different types of cloud software access on the cloud. So software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service.
And we, in previous conversations, really moved towards this because there was not a bright line between those things.
Which my understanding from others with institutional knowledge of the 2015 discussion and why the exemption was enacted initially was partly that challenge of distinguishing between what was and would not be taxable. So it was a full exemption. This goes in the opposite direction. It would be taxing all types of software accessed remotely. So as I said, there have been other versions of this language where new definitions were created and new categories. So like tangible personal property, a new category was created of taxable charges. This takes a slightly different approach because pre-written computer software is already considered tangible personal property. Sales tax applies to tangible personal property. So rather than creating a separate category, this says it doesn't matter how it's accessed, pre-written computer software is always taxable. So it is a slightly more succinct and a slightly more succinct way of taxing all types of pre-written computer software. It avoids any sort of concern about it being treated differently because it's accessed over the internet.
And I would flesh out what Abby just said by saying it also eliminates the any bleeding over from pre-written to craft created, that is to say customized. Because it's clearly pre-written, meaning doesn't matter who buys it or for what purpose. It's predestined to be bought as is.
Yes, and the other iterations of proposals of taxing the cloud always use pre-written computer software, but it did raise some of those questions because it was creating a new category. So this way it's only canned software, sort of off the shelf, regardless of how the software is accessed, including remotely. And that also, just from a really wonky tax policy and legal perspective, it keeps pre-written computer software, even if it's accessed remotely, in the tangible personal property category. It is not treating it like a service.
Could you say that again?
Certainly. So you have the sales tax on
retail sales, the primary category of taxable charges are tangible personal property, so physical goods. There are also like a list within statute of different types of charges, some of which are services. Vermont generally doesn't tax services, but there are some like admission to places of entertainment. So going out to the movies or the theater, that's considered more like a service. This keeps computer software, even if you don't get a physical disc, or I don't even know how you would get it now except online. If you're not downloading it, if you're accessing it remotely, it is still legally being considered tangible personal property in the way that gas, electricity, and water are considered TPP.
I guess then my question is, what is computer software that is not pre-written?
So that's the customized or like personally tailored, it's written to the customer specifications. And there is a definition of pre-written computer software that excludes, that's an existing definition, that excludes anything that's customized. So that remains non-taxable.
So if I hire a company to write software for me, the software that the cost of hiring that company is not
taxable. That's current law.
Okay.
And that would not be changed. The charge for them, either their service or the actual transfer of the software to you, that would be non-taxable.
Got it. Thank you.
It's where you're getting something that anyone goes online and can use the same sort of canned software. That is, if you were to buy a box or a CD, it would be taxable, but under the current session law exemption, it's not if you access it online. So this removes that online access exemption.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions about that? We have, I believe, talked through the costs of this before. So unless people want to, do people want to hear the numbers related to this? How many dollars is it for the Ed Fund?
18.4 million.
Thank you. Every year, it's more money.
And growing.
Good number.
May I also just point out, this is currently drafted to take effect on June 1st of 2024. So that would impact a whole fiscal year. That's why it's 1 month earlier than what you normally see for effective dates.
Thank you.
Explain that again.
So it's June 1st of next year. And because sales tax is collected and then remitted the next month, typically, most sellers are remitting on a monthly basis. This way, the first remittance would be in the fiscal year. So you wouldn't lose a month of revenues. But it is still a year out because this would be a change for software collection and for anyone who's selling pre-written computer software online, they would need to update their collection software.
Okay. I know you're not Julia, but do you have a sense of how much money those millions of dollars are on people's property tax bills?
So
Sorry.
I believe Julia's rule of thumb is for every cent, it equates to about $10 million. And I know that because I believe that was part of the discussion running the personal deals. And it was a nice kind of tidy, $30 million is roughly 3 cents.
Thank you. Okay. So we have a little bit more time. And so what I'm gonna do is make a very, very tiny pivot to taxes on services. I don't have an amendment prepared. It's not a suggestion. It's just sales tax on services was included in the RAND report on financing childcare. I think there are ways that these things can be done progressively and ways they can be regressive. And so I'm not adding this to the agenda as a suggestion, and I want to be explicit about that. I'm adding it as a opportunity to sort of discuss revenue that might be in front of us and to better understand what services even, sales tax on services even means.
I just, on the heels of Representative Beck's observation in the previous discussion, some of services are easily absorbed, expensed, if you like, simply adjusted to resolve into costs that are allowable anyway for businesses. Those are the professional services. Other services are, if you like, acquired by households. And so I think we could tailor that so that you take the hard edge off it, if you will.
There are also a lot of services that are primarily paid by women, and wind up being a pink tax if we tax them. There's all different angles to slice this one with. So Abby, I believe you have a presentation.
Yes.
Okay.
So that is under my name. Also under today's date, it's presentation of sales tax on services, and I will share that. And Pat also has a presentation to follow.
And we, next week, we're gonna sort of more officially have agenda items that say childcare financing. And for this week, I'm just sort of like adding random bits and pieces into other agenda items as we sort of move through them to just sort of like lay some context out for us.
Okay, great, thank you. So I've done a pretty broad overview, and then Pat does have more on the fiscal side. So please stop me if I'm going too quickly, but I'll try not. It's fairly lengthy, but I've tried to just make it not too much dense text on each slide, which is why it seems fairly long. So for a quick history of the sales tax, in the United States, Mississippi was the first state to enact a general sales tax. That was in 1930. They did not actually codify it, so put it into their version of the Green Books until 1934. But within 5 years, so this is during the Depression and property tax values are plummeting and those revenues are decreasing, half of the states codified a sales tax. Vermont came much later on the scene of sales tax in 1969 in Act 144. It was the last of the 45 states to impose the sales tax. Sorry, my computer's not.
Was it Governor Eakin?
Yes, I'm sorry, I did not track down the actual act. It was not easily accessible. But I could if you'd like.
We're good, thank you.
Okay, so at that time, so originally these state sales taxes only applied, as we just very relevant to our discussion, to tangible personal property. So it was goods or commodities, and some of the reasoning behind that was because goods were a larger share of household consumption, more so than services. There's an assumption that the wealthier someone was, the more goods they would be buying. Goods were easier to quantify because they're tangible, and that taxing services was being seen as a tax on employment or on jobs. But that said, over time, most states with sales tax bases have expanded to tax at least some services other than goods. And this has coincided with shifts in consumer behaviors. So we now have what's often referred to as a service-based economy, where there's more consumption of services than goods. And a quick, not going into great detail state by state, but most states generally have a similar structure to Vermont. So it's a sales tax on retail sales, which means a single levy that only applies to final sales to customers. And the sort of theory behind this is that only having tax on that final sale, it does not apply to resale, excludes business inputs. That said, it's never perfectly achieved. So there are different exemptions relating to business inputs to avoid that pyramiding where there's tax at several different transactions. But there are other versions where it's sort of hybrid. You might have sort of either a gross receipts tax or a tax on business purchases. But Vermont is like most states where it's a tax on retail sales. Current Vermont law, I apologize if you've seen this ad nauseum from me, but this is the general rule. So this is helpful to remember when talking about sales tax. It applies to retail sales of TPP and then any enumerated charges. So that's that list of more service-based charges unless there's an exemption. I mainly am really just talking about sales tax here, but use tax also is, when I'm talking about sales tax, I mean both sales and use. Vermont's definition of retail sale is any sale, lease, or rental for any purpose other than for resale, sublease, or subrent. That's how a lot of business transactions are excluded from sales tax because those are at wholesale. If they're purchasing it from one entity and then planning to resell it to the final consumer, that initial sale is not subject to tax. So there's not an explicit exemption for resale, it's excluded from the definition. But the end effect is the same, it's not taxed. Okay, so I did include the statutory list for sales tax of what services are taxable. This is what's in statute, but this is not a full list of every taxable service in Vermont. To note, public utility services, including gas and electricity, are subject to sales tax, but that excludes water and transportation. Phone or telecommunication services are also subject to sales tax, but there's an exclusion for coin-operated telephone service, paging, private communications, or value-added non-voice data service.
What is that? But excluding water and transportation, what does the transportation mean?
Services for, so sales tax, there's no sales tax on transportation services. This is straight from the statute.
But transportation is a public utility.
Oh, you mean like when you buy a bus ticket?
Taxi rides, bus fares.
That's my understanding, yes. This is, yeah, that's in the statute, this is in the same subdivision, public utilities.
Oh, it's public, okay, yeah, okay. Could I get a read on what value-added non-voice data service is?
I would have to get back to you on what that means. As I read that, I realized I don't know exactly what that means, but.
Comforting to me.
So
I think I actually know the answer to that.
coin-operated telephone services, would that now include using your card to use a phone?
Your card to use like a prepaid card, those are subject to sales tax.
Debit card? I don't, do you even see coin-operated phones?
No,
Yeah.
right, I mean.
There was one in the building, I can't remember.
Are there any phone booths anymore?
But they're all empty.
Where does Superman change?
Representative Maslin.
Because a couple of years ago, we spent a bunch of time on prepaid card, phone services.
Those are definitely.
Eventually settled on a definition that we could look at. I don't remember the particulars, but we did it.
Yes, I think that was within the universal service charge discussion as well.
Probably correct.
And my understanding is those are subject to sales tax. Those that are subject to sales tax are also subject to the universal service charge. But do you want me to do a summary of telephone charges?
We can do that in the context of the telephone fee stuff that we're doing, but we don't need to do it here, that's okay.
But I will look into that because I should know that anyway, that value added, what that means exactly. Cable TV, streaming, so there's a long definition, I just put streaming because that's what we're most familiar with, but access to cable TV systems or other audio or video programming systems that operate by wire, coaxial cable, light wave, microwave, satellite transmission, or by other similar means, so Zoom. Zoom is included. That was a big question at the beginning of the pandemic. Is taxable?
It is taxable.
Yes.
And it's the subscription cost that's taxed?
Yes, the charge for, yes. Any of your online TV streaming will include sales tax.
Okay.
Yes, and then we're gonna.
A quick question.
Move through presentation.
It reminded me this, sometimes you'll get a free use of something. And then after a little while, you start to pay, or sometimes it's just a free use.
No tax. No, so it's if there's a charge. It's on the sales price, so if the price is zero, there's no tax. A few others, rentals, that includes ski equipment, car rentals. There's a long definition relating to, it used to be called amusement charges. It's now admissions to places of entertainment. And so there's a list. It does exclude video games, pinball machines, anything that's operated by coin, token, or bills. I do not know if it's possible to pay with a card, but that would appear to be not covered by that monetary. It's very specific about the type of payment. And then photo, textile printing, so not exhaustive. There are other services that are taxable, and then I just wanted to give you.
But all to say, we're already taxing services.
So, yes.
Okay, great.
And
The door's already been opened.
There we go.
Okay.
So all states with a sales tax do apply it to some services, including Vermont. Even out of the 5 states that do not have a sales tax, still tax some services, but they're not under a sales tax, different tax type. So an example of phone and internet service, car rentals and hotels are taxed in New Hampshire, it's just not a sales tax.
What do they call
The taxes, I'm
it in New Hampshire?
not sure if they're gross receipts taxes. I can follow up on that. I did double check. I don't know the name. Sure, no, I can get that, that's quick check on their Department of Revenue website. Other states on the other end of the spectrum have very broad tax bases and they tax almost every service. So Hawaii, Washington State, South Dakota, and New Mexico do have very broad taxation. So almost every service, including veterinary care and some professional services. One example was investment counseling. So financial advising tends to fall into the professional services, which is often a category that's carved out. Legal services, healthcare services, those fall under that professional service sort of bucket. Hawaii is listed here and so are New Mexico. They also don't have the same type of sales tax as Vermont. They have a general excise tax and a gross receipts tax. It's actually on businesses, but those businesses then are allowed to pass it on to the consumer, which across the board they generally do. So it does end up falling on the consumers. Other states like West Virginia, and I do want to note that both Washington and West Virginia are streamlined states like Vermont. West Virginia also has a very broad taxation structure, but then they exempt a lot of types of services. So they say services are generally taxable, but professional services, contracting, personal and employment services, so not taxing jobs per se, are explicitly exempt. Just in doing some research for this, I came across Kentucky's proposal to tax 35 new services, including pre-written computer software. They categorize that as a service. So that's one example of sort of movement in this area. Most states do not tax personal services, like shown for West Virginia, it's typically not taxable. So dry cleaning, fitness costs, barber, and veterinary care services.
So the streamline has definitions of all services as well as.
Yes, Kentucky, yes, is a streamlined member state. So they might be an interesting example if you wanted to see how a streamlined member state has gone about taxing services. And these are live links in the PDF. So if you do want to follow up, and I don't know if we have time, I don't want to cut into Pat's presentation. I think I have already, sorry.
I think you have
The staff.
Does 15 minutes work for you? You want more than that? You want more than that? Look at your face. Okay.
I can also stop here because the last few slides are just summarizing reports. And I think that Pat has more, mine are just saying this is what has been done, but Pat actually has data that's maybe more interesting. But I did want to just refer you to this survey. It seems a little old now. It's from 2017, but the Federation of Tax Administrators has been conducting sort of nationwide surveys since 1990, and it's a really useful tool. And I have the link there, and it has a nice little interface, outdated, but it works pretty well to show what services states tax and don't tax. And I find this a useful way to categorize services. So the most common services that states tax are public utilities, as we saw Vermont does tax public utilities generally, and admissions to entertainment. And after those two sort of most taxed services are online services and fabricating, repairing, or installing. So that can get at the photo finishing or other types of production services. Those are generally most commonly taxed. Least or the less commonly taxed are computer services, personal services, not a lot of states tax those, but some do, and business services, and then there's sort of miscellaneous services. Where it's the least likely for states to tax that category is professional services. So you have legal, financial, healthcare services included there. And there have been different studies, and I won't get into all of those. They're in this presentation, but that I believe it was both Blue Ribbon structure report, as well as the tax structure commission report more recently in 21. They both recommended broadening the base, but not taxing healthcare in particular. So that has been called out as an area that has not been recommended to be taxed. So I will do with that. And there's, like I said, there are multiple more slides summarizing these different reports. If you would like to take a look at those. Thank you. And I'll pass over to Patch.
Highlighting the Blue Ribbon Commission and the streamlined states.
Excellent.
Like that's nice.
And there is also the link to the RAND report.
Thank you.
All right.
Sorry for my timing of your timing, Pat.
Oh, no, it's great. So I'm not gonna rush, but I might skip a couple of things just because Abby has already talked about some things. And I would encourage everyone to check out those additional slides that she has, because they do have some interesting summaries of some of those reports. So let me share my screen, get the right one. There we go. All right, so I am going to start a little bit broad and talk consumption taxes in general. And then we're gonna look at how some other states and other countries treat general consumption. You'll see that the United States and how we have our system structured is a bit of an outlier, but we'll get into that. And also just looking at how consumption patterns have changed over time. It's a particularly important question when you're talking about, what people are spending their money on in the context of a general consumption tax, like sales and use taxes. So first here is a list of, it appears the numbering is a little messed up, but here's just a list of some of the existing consumption taxes we have in the state. I think you're all familiar with these, but by and far, the biggest one is the sales and use tax, which, as you know, goes to the education fund. So there's sort of three buckets that I want to start with when thinking about the sales tax. It's what is taxed, what is not taxed by definition, and then what's exempted. So Abby ran through, what is taxed, generally speaking. It's just tangible personal property. And then there are some services that are explicitly called out, and that's how we treat services right now. But generally speaking, because they're not tangible personal property, they fall into the category of just not taxed by definition. And there do exist.
What happened?
I don't know. My computer's been really slow today, and
Have you turned it off in the last month?
it crashed yesterday. So I think that counts.
That does count. I always feel like that counts when my computer does it.
And I guess the third category are things that you exempt, and that's everything that was outlined in the tax expenditure report. I guess I'll just try and talk through some of the slides so you can follow on your computers, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe it'll come back. And so generally, these exemptions are
Back.
Don't ask me why. So generally exemptions are on basic necessities, things like groceries, clothing, and footwear, things that, you know, the sales tax is traditionally considered a regressive tax. You know, part of the reasoning there is that lower income households spend a higher proportion of their household income on things like these basic necessities. So that's why some of those are explicitly exempted.
I just have a quick question. Back on the previous screen, existing consumption taxes in Vermont, the second number 2, healthcare taxes. We see the provider tax and the premium tax. Aren't those the taxes that fund, at least partially, Medicaid? No, Medicare. No, Medicaid.
Medicaid matches.
Medicaid matches, yeah. Isn't that true? That money just rolls up. And then provider tax, some of that provider tax goes for home health, fund their, I forget what the revenue is that we give them.
Nolan is coming on Friday? Tomorrow? Nolan's somewhere in the agenda to talk about provider taxes section.
Okay, I'm trying to remember where all these taxes go. Sales and use, I know, meals and rooms, but go down, the provider tax and the premium tax. I think those are more complicated than just the run-of-the-mill sales and use tax.
So your chair took the words right out of my mouth. Nolan would be an awesome resource for you to consult on that with.
Okay.
It's a little out of my bailiwick, but I'm happy to look into it and give you an answer before he comes in.
All right.
So it looks like we're back to following along on your device.
Cool, you got it.
And I will have Shadi take a look at my computer. So, okay, we're gonna move to slide 5. This is again something you've seen before. This is from the tax expenditure report, and this is just looking again at that world of things that we exempt because we're either trying to promote certain behaviors. I think the wood boiler exemption that we were just talking about may be an example. The other reason is for basic necessities, right? So moving to slide 6. Why does the sales tax not apply broadly to services? Abby has already talked about this. It's historically not been something that was done. I believe on one slide at the time that these taxes were enacted, taxes on services were kind of considered like a tax on jobs. So I think if we're good with everything that she presented, we can move to slide 8, which I want to spend just a minute on this one because I think it's particularly interesting. Here we have 2 charts. The first one is showing over the period of 1934, so right around the time that these taxes were first being implemented through 2014, the percentage of household expenditures that have been on services and on goods. So you can see back in the 30s, heavily skewed towards goods. You know, at the time it was a manufacturing economy, so that was sort of the easiest well to dip the ladle into. And so you can see that there was an inflection point right around, looks like in the late 60s, maybe 1970, where that relationship totally flipped. So what does that mean? If households are spending a lower proportion of their household income on goods, which are the basis of the sales tax, you're going to basically be seeing sort of a narrowing of your base. And you can see that in the chart on the right, which if you look at the blue line here, if you look at the black line, you see there's this sort of steady negative progression of sales tax base over time, over that same time period. The red line is sort of if you want to keep that sort of level of revenue from that base. And you can actually see in the blue line how that's had to change over time just to sort of maintain that same level of revenue. So are we good? I have some charts on the next page too.
Those are really helpful. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm having a Zoom keeps trying to get back in. Okay.
We're following along, it's okay.
Oh, it's not something I'm doing. Something my computer's doing.
Oh.
All right, so moving on to slide 9, we have 2 more charts here. So you saw there that there was this big sort of nominal shift in the percentage of household income that was going towards services at the expense of goods, right? On the left-hand side here, you can kind of see that same relationship again this is from 1959 onward. And so what the Federal Reserve looked at here was sort of the same question, but moving to the chart on the right, let's adjust this for inflation so we can actually get a better picture of, quantity as opposed to just price change. So you can see when you adjust for inflation that services have been actually largely flat. So why is so much more money going into that bucket? Because inflation has been much higher in that arena. I think one thing that will sort of illustrate that is just think about college tuition since, the last 30 years. I hear some people used to be able to get a bachelor's degree for $5,000. I don't think that's necessarily the case now. It's not what mine costs, that is. Right.
Sorry, Jim.
Just to confirm what you said, when I headed off to college.
Oh, Jim, you're gonna make us so sad.
Yeah, I don't want
All right,
to.
Please
we'll wait
don't.
till later. But yeah, it was way cheap back then. Way cheap.
I guess that weren't too late. I don't think there's any broad insight in here except for the fact that, it's not necessarily the case that people are consuming more services and that's driving it all. I mean, we are consuming some more than we used to. I'm just going to leave the Zoom. We are consuming some more, but really a big portion of what's driving that change in the shift towards money going towards services is just much more aggressive inflation compared to goods in that sector. And then, there are some considerations towards the principles of taxation, which we get into on slide 11. I know this is a construct that Emily Byrne walked through with you all a couple of times, but I'm just going to touch on them briefly just because, the discussion of what we exempt, what is not taxed by definition and how that plays into the principles, all it does ultimately tie back into the discussion about taxing services. And we get into that a little bit with some of the recommendations that came from some of the reports that Abby has already mentioned. But first, when you're talking about taxing services, and the first pillar being sustainability and reliability, taxing services would represent a broadening of your base, right? So a broader base, it sort of protects you against a lot of economic shifts that can occur. Population growth helps, demographic change helps, and it just it gives you a more stable base, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Just having a much broader. You see this with I know with paid leave, we just talked about a payroll tax. That is a good example of a very broad base tax. So fairness, there is sort of a implicit unfairness in not taxing services for when you compare different types of households. So younger and lower income households tend to skew their consumption more heavily into goods, whereas higher income and older households tend to consume more services. So by not taxing a broad type of good like a service, in a way you're sort of subsidizing one type of, one category of consumption over another. And then so moving on to simplicity, if you have a million different exemptions, someone has to keep track of that, right? So having a lot of exemptions can make the system complex. You'll see later that some of the reports did have some recommendations towards, well, maybe we include many of these services, maybe we remove some of these exemptions, and in doing so, what you can actually do is bring down your overall tax rate on general consumption and still be raising the same amount of money and potentially even more. So again, economic competitiveness, we know we've looked at sales taxes in other states. Notably New Hampshire is a close neighbor. They do not have any form of sales tax on goods. I know Abby mentioned that there are a couple of services that they do tax in a couple of ways. And I think for accountability and tax neutrality, we can just skip those. As I think what is most interesting is if we jump to slide 14 and start looking at how other states and then other countries treat services. So like Abby said, these laws first came about in the 1930s. Vermont was the last to implement one. There are 5 states that do not impose a statewide sales tax. Those are New Hampshire, Oregon, Montana, Alaska, and Delaware. And then those 4 states you referenced that by default tax services and some are still, part of the streamlined agreement. So those are all defined and, available for taxation under that agreement. Which leaves 40 states which do not tax services by default. Although like with Vermont, there are some that are still taxed, but called out specifically. So this is the category of states that have to call them out specifically. On slide 15, just looking at our neighbors, Graham actually a couple of years ago did a count of the number of services. It's just a raw count. It's not necessarily the size of the services in the market, but just the count of services that are taxed in Vermont and our surrounding states. And you can see here, Connecticut runs away with it, right? They're almost at 100 different services that they tax, and Vermont's right in the middle, just over 40. And again, even though they don't have, so in addition to not having a sales tax, New Hampshire also taxes the fewest services. And if
I would be interested, you're talking about the number of services. I'd like to understand like the value of those services sometime.
Yeah, so all the way towards the end of this presentation, there is a slide referencing what is available in our fiscal facts booklet that we distribute. There are a couple of notes on that. So it provides, it's in the potential revenue sources section. So it provides probably 24, maybe 36 different services estimates for those. The only thing I'll note is that it does not account for purchases of services performed in Vermont for out-of-state customers, and it also does not account for out-of-state operators providing services to in-state. So it's just capturing the in-state, within-state market. But gives you a sense of magnitude.
Okay.
So slide 16 we're on now. I want to transition a little bit, and you might wonder why the heck we're talking about this in a
I think it's pretty exciting.
I want to talk about value-added taxes. Value-added taxes are done in 170 countries worldwide, and amongst the OECD countries, 37 of the 38 of them use value-added taxes for their general consumption tax.
OECD.
It's basically a classification. It's developed countries.
Okay, I never heard that.
But does anyone, I know you all have the slides, so you might cheat, but does anyone want to guess what the one exception in the 37 out of 38 is?
Switzerland.
United States.
Every time it's the exception.
I didn't think we were included. It was totally a trick question. I fell for it.
Right. So
Totally blew it. So excited about the
They're always neutral, so that's okay.
excuse me. So one aspect of value-added taxes is that they tax basically everything by default. That includes business-to-business purchases. That includes end final point of sale purchases. It taxes everything. Now there are some credits, and I'll walk you through the mechanism of that. But it's a general consumption tax on everything, and it's widely viewed as sort of the simplest approach to consumption taxes. And in looking, I believe the United States was also the only example I could find of a retail sales tax. So that's that only taxing the final point of consumption type of tax. So we're unique in both that we don't have something and we're the only ones to have something else. So one caveat with all this, because the United States does not have a sales tax on the national level, there is no way to coordinate a value-added tax as it in our current system. So we're going to talk about value-added tax, but given this current structure of how the U.S. treats consumption taxes, it's not an option for us. But
I think it's true, and I'd like your opinion on it. New Hampshire, because it taxes essentially wages and distributions, dividends, is as close as you get to a VAT, because the value added, generally speaking, is either retained by the business or paid out. And if you tax everything paid out in the form of dividends and wages, you get real close.
yeah, so I think that's kind of, I'm kind of speaking off the cuff here a little bit. I think that's kind of getting outside of the general consumption realm of thinking about it. But I'd have to think a little bit more if that's correct, that you are sort of capturing sort of indirectly that same type of market. But that's something to think about. Now, just to sort of level set everyone, I know I jumped right into value-added tax, but if we look at slide 17, I pulled this example of this, how sort of it works step by step from the European Union website or commission website or whatever it's called. So let's suppose that you own a hole in the ground and you mine iron ore from it. You mine $1,000 worth of iron ore and you sell that to a smelter. Now there's a 20% value added tax. So the actual money you collect from the smelter is $1,200. And that includes $200 that you're collecting in value added tax. Your operations in your hole in the ground, you purchased $240 worth of tools, right? And you paid $40. The 20% of that is $40 in value added tax. So when you go to remit your value added tax to this entity that's collecting, you actually only have to remit the $200 minus the $40 that you paid. So you're remitting actually $160. Now, step two, the iron smelter, they purchased, smelter being like the steel operation. They paid $200 in value added tax to you for your hole in the ground. And they spent another $20 in purchasing other supplies on value added tax. They go to sell that, it's worth $2,000. They collect $400 in value added tax. So they've already paid $220, right? They paid $200 to the mine. They paid another $20 in tools and supplies. So they are going to take that $400 and deduct the $220 from it. And what they ultimately remit is $180. So you can see here that the overall, I know I'm trying not to be too tedious here.
I think it's really helpful in the context of the wood burning conversation, even to think about sort of like where exemptions, we've set up this complicated system of exemptions and where they lie. So if that's the object lesson you're going towards in some way, then I think it's helpful.
Well, the object right now here is sort of to explain why we can't have this type of tax system, unfortunately. So in all this, you're seeing that they're getting credit for the value tax that they paid, right? There needs to be some sort of national entity to make sure that they can do that, which removes tax pyramiding or cascading, where you're taxing at every single level. I think we're good. Let's move on from this example.
I like the iron ore too. That's fun.
I can't take credit for coming up with it, but I thought it was interesting. So we've seen that 170 countries have value tax. Canada is one of them. They have a national one of 5%, and it applies to all goods and services purchased except for some essentials, groceries, rent, medical services. And, you know, in the example that I was just showing you, there are those credits, and Canada uses the same thing. Business buys supplies, they buy their inputs, they're paying the value tax, but they're able to deduct that from what they have to remit when they go. So that removes that level of tax pyramiding, and that's why, you know, in Vermont, we only tax at the final point of consumption, so that removes a lot of those business to business purchases and avoids that tax pyramiding.
So what slide are you on again?
I'm on 18. And
So I wonder if when we get to slide 20 or 21, if it makes sense to wrap up, and we've reserved you for after the floor today,
oh, happy.
so we can finish. Great, yeah.
Okay, yeah, let's go to slide 20. So I think that we're good on Canada unless there are any questions. You know, the slide for slide 19 for Europe is essentially the same. The European Union, you know, they have a national entity that can coordinate all these business inputs to avoid the business to business sales. But again, you know, just like Canada, just like all the OECD countries and the 170, services are taxed by default. And in doing so, you know, the amount of money that they have to raise to hit their budget mark or whatever, you know, they can have an overall lower rate. I will mention that obviously their taxes on general consumption are much higher than the 6% we have here. But their general tax structure is also much different, you know, including personal income and all that stuff. But again, most countries sort of approach services and tax them by default while allowing for some, you know, exemptions for things like medical services, which are, you know, sort of deemed necessities. Last slide.
I would just say what I think is a quick question. So when we are in Europe and we go to the airport, we have this VAT tax form that we fill out, and say you buy a nice woolen coat and you paid something like 60 or 70 American dollars in VAT tax. You get it back at home. Is that because of where you take possession? See, they'll send you a check when you get home if you fill the tax out and put the receipt with it. And so is that because we are taking possession of it in America? Or why is that we get the money back? We get that tax back.
I didn't know that was a thing.
Yeah.
So I can look in that.
If you go to Europe, you're losing tons of money if you buy anything. It works with all that stuff.
Well, I put some wine back for my husband. I should have done.
So you look into that a little bit more.
Sure.
And we're gonna talk much more broadly about services in America after the floor.
Yeah.
So slide 20, I actually think I've touched on everything here. You know, there's no federal general consumption tax, which makes a VAT tax not really an option for us. It still is the most commonly used form of taxation globally, and by default taxes pretty much every service, with some exceptions. There are ways that it's structured that avoid tax pyramiding because it does tax sort of business to business sales, things for commercial activities, but it provides those credits on the back end to avoid that. And then, so we can't have it here, but I think it's interesting to think about, and I wanted to bring it up because as the most universally adopted form of consumption tax and worldwide, by default, pretty much every one of these countries is taxing services. So it's illustrative for that purpose. And that is slide 20. So if we need to transition, now could be a great time.
Okay, thank you so much. We're gonna take a 10-minute break and we're gonna come back and talk about child tax credit and the earned income tax credit and then pick back up services after the floor.